Hey guys, and welcome to another video this week. Last week I promised you a video on deck building, so here we are. We're going to create something a little bit different to what you usually see. A lot of content creators, when they do the deck building videos, generally just build a deck and then explain why they pick certain cards or why they do this, why they do that. I'm not going to do that because, quite frankly, that helps you build that deck and really doesn't give you the framework you need to build your own deck, given whatever resources you have. So today, I'm going to teach you a framework that you can apply to whatever cards and packs you have to create a deck that works for you. Today we're going to be building a deck for the Soul Raid. The reason I picked the Soul Raid is that I have not played them before, so it is going to be a new warband for me. I have not built a deck. I don't know a lot of these cards. I'm using a very unique setup of cards here. So the cards we're using are the cards from the Soul Raid box, the Diachasm base set box, and the Essentials card pack. That's what you see in front of me here, these three piles. I've pre-sorted them into ploys, upgrades, and objectives just to speed this up a little bit. Now, I've picked the Soul Raid because I haven't played them before, which means I can't use my experience of their, especially their faction cards, and go, I'm going to put this in the deck. I think it's really good because I've played them before, and I'd say that way. A lot of decks that you see other creators make when they do deck building, they'll pick a card, they'll say, I'm putting Show of Force in, it's a good card, and that's it. They don't really explain the logic on how to find a good card. What happens when a new set comes out? Do you have to wait for them to tell you what's good? Well, we're going to go through the basics of this with you now. So first of all, we're going to start with our objectives. Okay, that's this pile right here. Now, if you're at home and you want to build with me, I'm going to pause at certain points so you can kind of follow along. Grab all your cards, sort them out into your objectives, your ploys, and your upgrades, and pause the video at various points and keep up to date. Now, the reason we start with objectives is because your ploys and your upgrades support your objectives. So when you put a card in your objectives, let's say put Denial in. I want to put Denial in because there are no enemy fighters in my territory into the game. Now, if I want to support that, well, I kind of want to add some ploys that help me with that. Now, that could be push ploys that push enemies out of my territory. It could be aggressive ploys that kill the enemies so they can't be in your territory. Lots of ways to do that, but generally, if you have the ploys first, then you're not going to be able to score your objectives as easier as the other way around. So, if you're playing at home, grab your objective deck, and then you're going to start sorting them into piles. Now, this is the kind of the weird part. There's no true math behind it. But grab your objectives, and how I do it is I sort them into piles of similar objectives. So if one is stand on an objective, say Treasure Hunter right there, well, I'm going to put that in a hold objective pile right there. And when it comes to something like Supremacy, I'm going to put that in the same pile. And what you end up with is a bunch of piles with different styles of play. Some styles might be aggro, some might be an opponent's territory, some might be a primacy pile, or maybe a hold objective pile. And there might be a pile of cards that are just like odds and ends. This is weird by itself. I'll put that in a weird pile. And there's also going to be a pile of cards that you just don't think are good. Maybe you're playing Soul Raid and you've got hunger objectives. They're not really useful. Just put them in that don't really want to use pile. You can look through it later. You're not chucking them out or anything. And we'll go through it now. So take a moment, pause the video, do this with all your cards, and then we'll come back and we'll have everything sorted into piles. Okay, done all that? Great, I'm back. I've done this as well. Now, I'm going to talk about I've got 6 piles here. I could have made more, but I chose not to. Really, there's no right or wrong way to do this. I guess the wrong way to do it is to have one pile for every card. That's just not great. You've got to consolidate them. My piles here, if you have a look at them, I've got this pile here is hold objectives. These are cards that make me hold objectives. This is aggro cards, so generally get kills or make an attack. This one here is movement, so doing things that move far or move twice, stuff like that. This pile is actually my random pile. It's just cards that I think are pretty okay, but are really not unique. I could have put these all in their own separate pile, but I just pulled them into one just so there's a bit of less space. This pile here is be in enemy territory, and this last pile here are cards that I don't think I want to include. These are all my hunger cards. These are cards that I read and I'm like, I'm not going to use that at all. So they're my 6. You'll have your own. If you've got less than 3, I'd say try and split a few out. Get the big one and try and maybe split it out a few times. You can see I've got a lot of aggro cards here. This is my biggest deck. And then also these, the hold objective and the be in enemy territory one are quite big. I could have taken my aggro one and split it maybe into do damage and get kills as 2 different sort of smaller decks, but I'll keep it as one for now. It's just an option if you want to. Now, the next step is to look at your warband. You've picked it, I imagine, at this point. If you haven't, pick one now. Look at the strengths of your warband, right? You've got these piles here. You can run hold objective on any warband. You've got plenty of cards here. You've got aggro. You've got all sorts of things you can do. But you've got to decide what the best way to play your warband is. Now, generally, you look at your warband strengths. For Idoneth, my strength is that I have big movement. I can move 4. I can move twice. And also, I'm pretty good at attacking. I'm not great at holding objectives. I haven't got that many fighters, but generally moving and attacking are the two things I do pretty well. So generally I want to identify that, and then when it comes to my objectives, I want to lean into that. It doesn't make sense to take a warband that's good at holding objectives and make them aggro. And a warband that's got 3 models, for example, they're not going to hold objectives. How do you score supremacy when you lose one of your models? You can't. It's not possible unless you do some janky stuff. Take the 7, 6 model warbands and lean into the objectives at this point. Take your small elite warbands and figure out their playstyle and how you're going to work with them. Don't take Seraphon or Grimwatch and have to put in all these cards that make them do damage in order to get kills. It doesn't work. So now that I've taken my cards and put them in front of me like this, I'm looking at my warband, I'm thinking, what do I want to run? Now, I've had the benefit of thinking about this for a bit. This isn't my first time sitting down here doing this. And I've decided in my head, there are a few decisions I need to make. There's a lot of aggro cards that I like, so I'm going to make them an aggro warband. So I'm going to take some of these. And the next choice is sort of, what else do I want to do with that? Aggro isn't reliable, you need glory otherwise. I'm going to do move into enemy territory. So the 2 decks I've selected for the warband are move into enemy territory and get kills. And they kind of work well together, right? You move in there, you get kills, it works. There was an option here that I could have done. I could have taken actually the move into enemy territory one and taken hold objective and played a style that was move into enemy territory and hold their objectives. And there's a few good cards in this deck that I noticed that you could play that style with. In the end, I decided I might try that one day, but for now, I'll stay simple. I'll just go aggro with that. But when you're looking through the cards and sorting them out, you'll notice some trends. At that point, make notes and you can try them out. And that's a part of this, is refining your decks down. So now we've done this, select your 12 objectives. You're gonna go up to 14, you're going to 16 objectives, but start building that deck out. And I'll build mine, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about like what the next steps are with your objectives, or the final steps with the objectives. So start building it out, select your objectives from your limited piles you want, and then we'll come back in a moment and we'll have a look at what we've done. Welcome back. Hopefully that wasn't too hard. It might take you a while. It took me obviously half a second, but I'm kidding, it took me a while as well. But you should now have 12 cards in front of you, 12 objectives. If you haven't quite got it down to 12 yet, that's fine. Let's talk about that now, a little bit of the process on how to refine your objectives down. So looking at mine here, I have these 6 cards here were from my aggro pile, like kill things. I've picked them because I think they're easy. These 4 are from my movement one, so get into enemy territory. I've actually picked 2 from 2 other piles. Surging Tide, it was in my movement deck instead of my move into enemy territory one, but it's pretty easy to score, and I think it works well with what I've got. And I've got Great Gains as well. Great Gains is a weird one, and it took me a while to sort of figure this out. And the reason Great Gains is in here is because of the next point, and that is your glory ceiling. When you build your first deck, you need to make sure you have enough glory in that to win the game. Now, the common numbers you want to hit are for aggro warbands, you want to hit about 16. This is 15. This is a little less, but that's okay. And then for whole objective warbands, you want to be up at 22. So if you add all your objectives together, you want to get 22. Now, the reason we've done it this way is what it means is then we've got these 4 columns of things. Actually, I can put Surging Tide in this column here because it's similar. I've got 3 things I'm trying to do in this game. Kill enemies, move into enemy territory, and this one here is just get glory. Shouldn't be too hard. Now, the reason it's like this, and I haven't got cards all over the place, is because in a game of Underworlds, you have 12 activations. That's 12 turns to score all your cards. Because that's your goal in the game. You want to score all of your cards. If you score 6, then you're missing out on potential glory. So you can refine your deck down and get it so you're scoring every card in every game. Some games you fall behind, you miss some dice rolls, it happens. But your goal is to score all 12. So now we've done that, we've got our decks. Now, you should check your glory right now. If you're below the numbers I said, so 16 for aggro, let's say 15, 16 for aggro, and like 20 to 22 for hold objective, then maybe swap out some of your 1 glory cards for some 2 or 3 glory cards. Generally, a lot of your end phase cards can have 2 or 3 glory on them. A lot of the 2 glory ones are really good these days. And a lot of your surges are going to be just 1. The other thing is you're going to have 6 surges in your deck and 6 non-surges. So make sure you have 6 surges. They're really good. They cycle through your deck faster. It's always worth having full 6 of those. And the last little rule is, and I probably should have mentioned this before I made you build your deck, is you should only have a maximum for starters of 1 card that is scored into the game. And what I mean by that in this deck, we have got Conquest, which is scored in the 3rd end phase. And not only is it conquest, but it's also cards that you realistically won't score until the third end phase. For example, Absolute Dominance is a third end phase. Pure Carnage, yeah, you could technically score that in the the second phase maybe. But those cards are all scored at the end of the game. If you have too many of these cards, your deck will break. You won't score cards. You have to chuck them out and you'll miss glory. So my guide for starters is only one. Now, as you get really advanced at deck building, and if you're watching this video, you might not be there yet, but as you get really advanced, you can start to bend some of these rules. But let's start with some basic rules for now. And as you start to understand deck building into a lot of depth, we can do that again. So now that we've done this, we've got our 12 objectives. We'll put them in a nice pile over here. We're going to remember what they are. We can refer back to them. We're going to move on next to ploys. Now we're going to do the same thing with ploys that we did with objectives. And let's sort them into piles of what they do. So you've got some ploys that are extra damage, or maybe aggro ploys we'll call them. Some are push ploys, some are move ploys. Ploys do all sorts of things. So do the same thing. Take your ploy deck, build them into piles. If you have a spellcaster, I haven't got one, but if you do, take your magic cards and put them in the ploy deck as well. They work in the same phase, so put them all together. Build your deck out, separate them. I'm going to do the same with my cards, and we'll back in a moment to talk more about how to add ploys to your deck. Okay, welcome back. Now, I've separated my ploys. This was a bit harder for me because there's a lot of random cards that sort of do a lot of random stuff as far as ploys are concerned. Objectives are a bit more streamlined. So if you had more trouble with this than objectives, so did I. So don't stress out too much. Now, I've got my 8 piles here. It's more, but let me explain what I've done here. This pile here are ploys that do damage to enemies in various ways. These are sort of, I'd say, supportive aggro ploys. They sort of help me do more damage to my opponent. This is my movement ploys, so give me extra movement. This one here is my push ploys, so things that let me move hexes or confusions in there, so you can swap. All those weird movement ones are in there. This here is, I've got Spinefin Toxin. It's defensive ploys, things that stop my opponent doing damage to me. That's pretty good. This here is sort of my weird but good pile. There's a lot of really weird ploys in there that I think could be good, but I'm not sure. This here is my weird but maybe not so good pile. And this here is my other random assorted stuff. Duel of Wits is in there. There's a lot of really weird one-off cards. So these 3 here are a bit hard to sort. We'll go through them in a bit as far as pulling cards out. But now we've got our ploys. We've sorted them into piles. You can kind of see I'm liking, for example, plus move with the cards I have. So sometimes cards like Winged Death, for example, if I had that in my deck right now, I would find it very hard to score because I haven't got enough ploys to really get that through. So at this point, you might actually go back to your objectives and pull some cards out. Now, I didn't put Winged Death in because I knew I didn't have many of these ploys. I kind of shortcutted to the end there. But if you added cards and you're like, well, okay, I need to have +2 moves in there, and you've only got 1 card, it won't work. The general rule is, if you need to do something in an objective, you need 2 to 3 ploys that help you do that. If you need to push, you need to have 2 or 3 pushes. Because chances are, if you only have 1 card, it won't be in your hand when you need it to be in your hand. So in this case, I haven't got Winged Death because it's in there. I've got all these ones though. So what am I trying to do with my deck? I'm trying to get into enemy territory and I'm trying to kill things. So what ploys do I want to get? I want to put in ploys that help me kill. So a lot of that stuff. Ploys that help me sort of move in. So I'm actually going to put like a lot of the push ploys in here because I think that they will help me get in enemy territory. If I get driven out, I can push back in to score my objectives, obviously. And I'm actually going to put some defensive cards in as well, because when I get in enemy territory, they're going to be trying to hit me back. So I want to try and stop that and keep my fighters alive so I can keep killing. So I'm going to build 10 ploys from these piles, these 3. I'm not going to look too much in this, except for Duel of Wits though, that goes in every deck. And from there, we'll come back and we'll have 10 ploys that we can work with, and those 10 ploys will support our objectives, which we've already built. So go ahead and do that now. Make sure you only get 10. If you're thinking, I can go 11 or 12, no, it's always bad. Don't do it. Trust me, if you have an amazing ploy and you go to 11 cards, there is less chance of you getting that amazing ploy when you need it. It just waters down your deck. If you've played Magic the Gathering before, you understand the logic behind that. But the general rule is always run 10 ploys, 10 upgrades. So get your 10 ploys, put them together. We're back in a second and we'll have a look at what I've picked and how it supports my objectives. Okay, welcome back. Now, before I went to that sort of little intermission when you built your deck, I realized I did the thing that I hate, and that is saying, oh, Duel of Wits goes in every deck because it's good. Let me explain why this card is good and why you see it in so many decks. You can understand the logic behind it. The logic behind running 10 cards and not 11 or 12 is the same logic why Duel of Wits is good. Duel of Wits means essentially you have 9 ploys, which means you can have 9 amazing cards that you are more likely to draw than you are having 10 or 11. That 10th, 11th card isn't going to be as good as that first one you put in your deck. Duel of Wits essentially is 2 of my other cards. Well, it's generally only drawing an extra card because it is itself. But Duel of Wits lets you get to your better cards faster. That's why it's in a lot of decks right now. If you're struggling to put cards in, I'll take Duel of Wits out. Just think of it as Duel of Wits is 2 of your best ploys. Instead of you taking it out to put in your 10th or 11th best ploy, it doesn't work so well. Anyway, let's have a look at what I've done here. I've built this out a little bit. Duel of Wits is its own thing. I've explained why that's good. And we'll go through these ones quickly. These 4 cards here are my aggro ploys. They let me do things that help kill, plus damage, for example, rerolls. This one is scything, and this one is extra dice. Those things will help me get those kills that help me score these objectives, because I obviously have a lot of kill fighter objectives in there. These 3 here are defensive ploys. Phantasmal Forms, so everyone has defense 3. Cloud of Midnight, can't be targeted, and Spinefin Toxin. These 3 help my fighters stay alive. These 2 here, Mirror Move and Center of Attention, are push ploys that help me get into enemy territory. And I've picked those 2 because they have the most use. Center of Attention, for example, can be used offensively to pull people off objectives, or they can be used on your own fighters to pull them into range. There's so many different clever uses for Center of Attention, whereas a sidestep is limited to your fighters in 1 hex. Center of Attention can be all of your fighters and your opponent's fighters if they're positioned well and 1 hex in the right space, and you get to choose the direction. And Mirror Move is a good counter. If they sidestep away, you follow them. So they're the 10 ploys I've got. I've picked them because they support my objectives, so it's about killing things, getting into enemy territory with these 2, Duel of Wits, I've explained that, and then keeping them alive. That's why these 10 are here. If you're running Hold Objective, for example, as a warband, you probably wouldn't have these 4. You don't need to get kills to score objectives. You might have more of these defensive ones here. You might have more push ploys to get yourself on objectives more. But you can tell that once you've built your objectives, you'll be able to determine what ploys you need to support them. So that's the general gist of it. So now we've done that, we've built our 10, we're on the home straight here in the last part, which is probably more of the fun part. These 2 are your main course, this is what you're sort of playing your game around, but the last part, upgrades, they're your toys. That's how you get there. These are the extra things you get throughout the game that make you feel really strong. So we're going to be on to ploys next, and you guessed it, we're going to move them into categories, but this time it's a little bit different. For ploys, we're going to have 3 categories. We're going to keep it simple. Those categories you're going to make are going to be offensive, stuff like +1 damage, +1 dice. Defensive, which is things like +1 wound, and then utility. And those are generally the ones that don't do anything offensive or defensive. Think Quickening Greaves, that's a utility. It doesn't really help you aggressively, offensively or defensively, it gives you some utility. So build it into 3 piles. We'll keep this simple, and we'll move on to upgrades in just a moment. So go ahead and do that now, sort it, and we'll come back and we'll look at our upgrades. Okay, that would have been a bit faster than the other 2, I hope. I've got my 3 piles here. I've got my offensive upgrades, my defensive upgrades, and my utility upgrades. And now we're going to do basically the same thing that we did with our ploys. We're going to look at what we need to do. In our case, we actually need something from all 3 columns. We are playing aggro, so we will need some offensive upgrades to help us kill better, more consistently, of course, but also get the right amount of damage to put fighters out of their misery after 1 hit. We need some defensive cards to keep our fighters alive because we are going into enemy territory. And utility is probably the one we don't need so many of, but there are some interesting cards in here that can help us score our objectives. Quickening Greaves is always a fun one. If you need to push onto objectives, it's a great one to throw in there. But we'll go through that now. I'm going to pull out 10 and I'll explain my choices as to why I picked them. You do the same thing. Remember, we're staying to 10. If you have 11 or 12, what's the worst one in there? You don't want to drop it, but you want to get rid of it, obviously. You gotta have 10. The other thing is consistency is important. So having upgrades that do very similar things will mean you draw it more often. For example, +1 damage. If you have 1 of them in your deck, you'll get it once every 2 games maybe. But if you have 2 or 3 in your deck, you're gonna draw it all the time. And so if you need that +1 damage, put in Great Strength and Savage Strength and Glory Seeker and have them all in there so you're consistently upping your damage throughout the game and not waiting and hoping for that 1 card to get drawn. Anyway, go ahead and build your 10. I'll show you what I've done now and explain my logic after just a brief moment, and we'll finish off our decks with our upgrades. All right, welcome back. That's kind of fun. You get to go into the lolly jar and pull out some fun little toys. I always enjoy the upgrades. It's like the last icing at the end of the cake. Before I talk about mine, I want to shout out to John, who painted our models. I did a video on it last week, but we've got his Ideneth on the table here. They look great. Just wanted to give him a little bit of extra props because, whenever I use them, It's nice to have them there. Let's look at this. So I've kept them in the categories. So I've got 5 offensive upgrades, 4 defensive, and then 1 utility. My 1 utility is duelist speed. And quite frankly, this would be the 10th card. If there was a better card from one of these 2 categories, for example, another +1 wounds, that wasn't -1 move because I like the movement, I probably would have dropped this for that. But I didn't, and this is what I went with. Duelist speed's a bit of fun, and I think that my leader can probably use it. There's a few things to consider when doing your ploys now. One is, any fighter restricted card is a risk. If you lose that fighter, you're screwed. Now, if you're playing something like Hrothgorn, and if you lose him, you've lost the game anyway, it might be okay. But when you come to a lot of warbands, especially some of the more 7 or even Zarbag's Gits, and you've got an upgrade that only goes on 1 fighter, especially in the best of 3, that fighter could get targeted down a bit. So I'd definitely recommend putting a lower priority on any restricted cards. That being said, all the Ideneth restricted cards are fine because they're just the 3 main ones. What have I picked? Let's have a look at my offensive ones first. So I've got Glory Seeker, +1 damage, and it's when it matters too, when you need to kill 4 wound fighters. Savage Strength, +1 damage, and it's -1 defense, but only one of my fighters has 2 defense. So that's actually just a free +1 damage. Great Strength, once again, +1 damage. You can see a trend here. I've got Fighter's Ferocity. On a crit, it's +1 damage. Not as reliable as the other 3, but that's okay. If I were to drop one of the +1 damages, it'd be Fighter's Ferocity. And my last one here is Unstoppable Fury. I get to re-roll 1 attack dice when I make a charge. Now I've got some cards that help go in and get kills, so I want to be charging. So that gets me a re-roll, which is really nice. Let's go to we'll talk about offensive quickly. So when looking at +1 dice versus a re-roll, they're very similar. +1 dice is always better, but a re-roll's almost as good. The niche scenario is when you have a similar amount of dice as them, having more dice is better. But generally, if you're rolling 4 dice, and it's a decision between having 5 dice or having 4 in a re-roll, basically the same thing. So don't stress too much about that. Defensive-wise, we've got Great Fortitude, +1 wounds, keep our guys alive. Born from Agony, +1 wounds and lethal don't damages. Same thing again. Armor, -1 dice from adjacent, that's always good. -1 dice is very powerful. And then Sanguine Pearls, -1 damage. So those 4 cards are very good at keeping us alive. And Duelist Speed lets us push a fighter after an attack action. Probably the weakest card here. If I had more decks to choose from, I probably would replace that with something else. But you know what? I'm on a limited deck and it will work just fine for our games. So we've got our 10 there. You've got your 10 as well, and you're probably in a great spot. Now you've actually built a deck. You've got it in front of you. But this is actually only the start of deck building. A lot of people consider this to be the end. They've built their deck, great, that's it. The good players, that's fine. But for the great players, there's the next step, which is refinement. And that is taking this deck and playing games of Underworlds with it. And every time you play a game, especially look at your objectives. Am I scoring this every game? Is there an objective that I'm struggling to get? Every time I draw it in my hand, I feel like, oh, that's awful. For example, my last warband I put serious effort deck building into was Canaan's Reapers. One of their objectives is your leader is on an objective in enemy territory. That seems pretty easy to get, and it is very easy. But as I played the game, I found out that whenever I charge Canaan forward, it'd be charging him away from the battle because generally I'm fighting in my territory. And I wanted to keep him next to my Mortec. So I found that that card, whilst on paper looked good, once I started playing, it came out of my deck and got replaced by something else. I think it was Martial Mage that went in instead. So as you play, you'll see things that do and don't work. Make changes, refine your deck. Don't worry about losses and dice so much. Always look at, oh, when I drew that card, was it what I needed? No, it wasn't. Well, why wasn't it? All your cards should always work for you. So be critical, evaluate your deck, and spend a lot of time working on that. Play tons of games, tons of reps, and your deck will be amazing, and you'll start winning games of Underworlds. And that's it. You can see here I've got my final deck. Last thing I need to do is sleeve this and then start playing it. The tough thing about Underworlds is what cards are good? How do you figure that out? And there's not really a good formula for that. A lot of it is experience. You play the game enough, you start to see which cards work and which don't. Generally, the simpler the card, the better it is. Some of the really complicated ones are very niche. Objective-wise, the easier to score, the better. But you also need to find cards that are maybe a little trickier to score, but you can score them reliably. A card, for example, Bold Deeds. Look that one up. That's a card that is not dead easy, but you get 2 glory, and it's not the most difficult thing in the world to get. Obviously, it's not in this deck because it's in a different box. But the point is, over time as you play, you've got the fundamentals now, you can now build a deck, you'll start to learn which cards are good. And that learning comes with experience, and there's no shortcut for experience. You can look at top people's decks and see what they're adding, But always critically ask yourself, why are they adding that card? What is that doing? If something looks unusual, think about it. Is it unusual because I haven't played with it yet? Or is it unusual? Is it a bad choice? Or is it good and you don't quite understand yet? So there's a lot to learn from. Anyway, take your deck, go and play tons of games, hopefully have success, keep refining, changing cards around, and best of luck in your games of Underworlds. We'll see you next week.